Okay, we're all set.
All right. So we have a quorum. Just about everybody is here. So I'll convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission, our first meeting in 2022. Happy New Year to everybody. It's January 11th, 2022. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it?
Not from staff.
All right, then we have our agenda as presented. Second item is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us. It could be an item on the agenda or something not on the agenda. Megan, do we have anyone who wants to speak?
Yes, Sharon Busher wrote before the meeting, so we'll start with her. And then we do have 3 members of the public that are on tonight. If anybody else would like to speak, just use the raise hand function and we'll allow you to speak after Sharon.
Great, thank you. Sharon, welcome. You're on mute. There you go.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm looking forward to your agenda tonight because it will give you the opportunity to look at this ordinance in a little more detail and actually give feedback to the council. It's something that I have wanted from the get-go, and I'm glad you're getting a chance to do that. I wanted to address, so all this time I've been really focused on the process. And so today I actually read the ordinance and I have some comments about the ordinance itself now. So my comments are focused on TDM, on the maximum parking requirement charts, which I had asked, I had made a comment at the first ordinance committee meeting to have staff look at those charts because I didn't think anyone had, and I know that planning did do that, and I'm very thankful. I do have some questions, a couple of questions. And then I'm not really clear, although this was raised by planning, by planning, who's Megan, sorry, Megan, I just feel for you. About how this all dovetails with the institutional parking plan. And I'm not really clear on that, although there's some reference to that in the plan. So first off, I just want to start with the TDM, and my comments are really focused on this. And they support what the staff is raising as concerns. I'm not sure. I think TDM is a great tool for larger development. But when you get down to 5 units or less, and when you get into neighborhoods, I really think that some of the criteria is difficult to meet. And it really begs the question, since the intent of getting rid of the minimum parking standards is to pave the way to allow development to occur, I must admit, when I read some of the requirements for TDM, I feel this is a deterrent for development to occur in neighborhoods and smaller 5 units or less. And so I really question how this will work, and I'm not supportive of it. I think 10 units or more, and I'm not sure if that can happen in the neighborhood section, neighborhood areas of the city. But anyways, I certainly don't think it should come down to 5 units or less. As far as the institutional parking, I referenced, if indeed we limit the amount of parking or don't have any minimum standards for the University of Vermont, I feel like we're taking a huge step back into a time when Emily Lee wasn't on the Planning Commission. I was a city councilor, and she had done tons of work and went around presenting it to us about the impact of UVM and parking and student noise, et cetera. And I just feel that if indeed they don't have requirements for themselves on their campus, once again, their cars will spill over into streets where parking is allowed. And I'm concerned about that. So that's all I have to say about the two as they work together. the last comment has to do with the charts, which is a big chunk of this. And I wanted to say that I would respectfully, I'm going to try to present in writing more focused comments about them. But for one example, it has to do with the neighborhood districts, and it talks about museums and not having any requirement for parking for museums in the neighborhood district, because there aren't any, but there are. There's Fleming Museum. And so it sort of discounts that Colchester corridor, which is neighborhood and residential. And yet you discounted it a while ago by saying that this was where there could be shared parking plans. And you haven't really acknowledged, we as a city haven't acknowledged that there are sections of Colchester Avenue where it's spot on what you're saying, but there are other sections. For example, if you go from Trinity Driveway all the way down the hill to Barrett Street, that's all residential. It's not institutional, and all of these criteria don't apply. So I'm very concerned about some of the proposals that don't have any maximum standards here. And then my last comment, Andy, I'm sorry, I know I'm taking too much time, but my last comment is that in these charts, I would respectfully ask that you look carefully at how we are putting into these the fire department and the police department and other emergency services. I'm not sure we should be dictating. I think they need to have the parking they need. And I'm not really trying to be environmentally unfriendly, but I'm just feeling like I just feel like when they come up with a plan, the plan should be scrutinized, but I'm not sure we should really restrict the maximum number of cars that can be there based on what the need is for the public to access and for the community to have the building staffed for our emergency services. So I'm going to end there. I know I've left out some things, but I will try to put this in writing. I believe that what you're doing is only going to discuss it tonight. I know this isn't a dialogue, but is that true? Can you respond to that?
I believe that's so. We're going to get more clarity on what the referral is for Megan once we get into this. But my understanding is what's come to us it's sort of a hybrid. It's not quite the normal process, but it's asking us to take a deeper look at it than we've been able to in the past.
Okay,
we'll,
then the
we'll get
last
more
thing.
clarity on that shortly.
Okay, then the only other thing I wanted to say was if someone would look at those maximum parking standards as they apply to things like Centennial Field and all, once again, I just don't think that they're reflecting reality today or in the future. So anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon.
Okay. That is the only person that I saw. Oh, sorry. Sandy Tebow is here from Catma. Go ahead,
Okay.
Sandy.
Thanks.
Great. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, Sandy Tebow, Executive Director at CATMA, the Chittenden Area Transportation Management Association. We produce the Joint Institution Parking Management Plan, which Sharon was referring to in her comments. And I just want to say I really appreciate the commission and the city updating this ordinance at this time. We've been working hard to improve the JIP, the Joint Institution Parking Plan, particularly over the past few years, assessing its purpose, improvements that we can make to the content and the data. And we've been measuring our success on TDM on the Hill with our survey data and over the past year and a half with parking count. So I do, would be interested. I don't know if the impacts of TDM are going to come into play With this ordinance update, and I know the city has plans to do a study on the impacts of TDM. So I guess one of my thoughts on this ordinance is how you measure the success of TDM, if requiring it for developers of all sizes or businesses. I think that's an interesting comment from Sharon about smaller developments and sites, and I think we could think creatively how TDM can be provided or shared with these sites or general public, maybe through education and awareness initiatives. And I also want to just comment that we're really in a different time right now with the pandemic. We've been monitoring, commute behavior during the pandemic. How is telework going to continue? How is telehealth going to continue, or learning remotely? So I think, understanding what that change of behavior is, because obviously it impacts the demand for parking. So yeah, just wanted to make those comments and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Is there anyone else, Megan?
Nope, that's all I see.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll close out the public forum. We're on to the chair's report, and the main thing to report is that the council sent us back this ordinance that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So we got what we asked for at our we sort of got what we asked for at our last meeting. Again, Megan will fill us in more on exactly what the referral is that they gave to us. It's not fully where it's coming to us as though we have full control over it at this point, but it's looking for more detailed comments and giving us more time than what we've been able to do before. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll talk more about it in a few minutes. Director's report, Megan.
All right, a couple updates for you. So also at our last meeting, we talked about the commission's support for the creation of a new planner position within our department. That was approved by the city council at their meeting, by the city council at their meeting on December 20th, I think it was. And that position was actually posted yesterday. So this is a really exciting addition of new capacity in our department that I know, kind of speaking for David as well, that we had been really hoping to be able to achieve for a long time. So as far as the update too on where we are with the principal planner, we have closed the application, and I have done some initial interviews with several applicants, and we'll be working to set up some interviews with a few of them next week. So that process is moving along, and we'll keep you updated on how that goes. We've also talked a lot about in the past few meetings our kind of work plan for this year and coming years, as well as funding and resources to support that work. So two other quick updates for you. You also provided a letter of support for the department to apply for a municipal bylaw modernization grant with the State Department of Community Development. And we found out yesterday that we were successful in receiving the funds for that. So that will support some of the housing work that we'll be doing this year, specifically around missing middle housing that we talked about at our last meeting. And we're also working with the Department of Permitting, the Public Works Department, to see if any of the projects that are on our radar for FY23 and FY24 could potentially qualify for the Regional Planning Commission's annual work program. They have an influx of additional transportation related funding that they are managing right now, and feel pretty optimistic that they'll be able to provide a lot more support within communities in Chittenden County. So we're working really hard to see what projects could potentially be applicable for that funding, hopefully submitting a number of things for that. So that could be another opportunity to support some of the work that we've talked about for coming years. And then I think you all have probably heard at this point that back in mid-December, the mayor and several city departments announced an initiative to advance some housing work. When we first started talking about this, we thought it might take the form of a housing summit 2.0, like we did back in 2019, which informed a lot of the work that you all have been doing for the last few years. But ultimately, we moved forward with an announcement of a number of strategies that this department and the Planning Commission, as well as other departments and city partners, will be involved in, that are really targeted at housing in a number of ways, and encompasses the three kind of big zoning things that we've been talking about: the enterprise district, missing middle housing, and zoning for Trinity campus. So with that kind of umbrella out there now, I would expect that the actual work to advance those zoning changes will be filling your agendas in the very near term. And in particular, I know that you may know that UVM presented just last night to the City Council very briefly on their aspirations for creating new undergraduate and graduate student beds on the Trinity campus, and how that relates to the goal to make some zoning modifications to that campus. So you'll see that soon. And then one final thing, some of you, I think, know him, but this week is Jay Appleton's last week with the city. Jay has been a longtime staffer in what was previously the Planning and Zoning Department. He was responsible for the city's GIS system, as well as really helped us to troubleshoot a lot of the systems that helped us manage permitting in the city. So Jay will be departing after, I think, it's got 24 years. He was here almost as long as David was, and this will be his last week. So there's definitely a number of major retirements happening in the city right now. So I think that's all I have.
Great. Thank you. Any questions for Megan? Just on anything she said? All right, then we'll go on to item 5, which is the proposed CDO amendment, minimum parking and TDM requirements. We discussed this some at our last meeting, and if you recall, we sent a memo to the City Council recommending that this get referred to us. We were, I think, asking that it go through the normal, be referred to us through the normal process that things come to us. It's not quite what happened, but it did come back to us. And Megan, if you want to pick it up from there and just explain what the referral is. I understand they went this back in February. So if you could also just let us know, like beginning of February, end of February, how many meetings will we have between now and when it has to go back?
Yeah, that's a good question, Andy. And the Council Ordinance Committee met a couple days before the Christmas holiday to talk about this again, and we had passed along your specific request that this come back to you for an opportunity to review it in more depth and, you know, collect some input on it and provide recommendations to them. I know Councilor Mason in particular was really supportive of making sure that this amendment had time for you all to take a look at it and provide comment on it. So the committee referred it to you for your review and comment and asked for it to be returned to them or for your work to be returned to them for their action in February. They don't actually have a meeting scheduled for February yet, but they were pretty clear that it was their intention that as a committee, they want to be able to take it up again and potentially refer it out to the City Council at some time in February. So we have all of tonight's meeting dedicated to talking about this. We can talk about it again at your meeting later this month. And if we need to, we could probably talk about it at your first meeting in February before you would need to kind of wrap up your comments and refer them to the ordinance committee.
Great. Any questions on the process at least? Michael?
Yeah, you're probably going to get in this, Megan, but what I think an important part of this is just the public forum on this particular topic. I saw you had a note on, you know, getting the word out, but what, I suppose, when would we expect to try and organize, you know, an effort to hear on that?
So you mean in the slides that were in the agenda packet?
Yeah, it looked like there was some advertising about it. I guess, is it just generally, hey, we're working on the, I don't know. And also this, I guess, is just a question to be informed about on major initiatives, how the planning commission goes about soliciting feedback for those that aren't regular listeners.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The recommendations that were listed in terms of community engagement around this policy were recommended to the council ordinance committee as things that staff felt like they should do at a minimum to help get the word out and recruit feedback on this. So those steps are not all expected of the planning commission at this stage. Some of those included, using tools like Front Porch Forum and or NPAs to help spread the word. We engaged with a large number of people as part of the last parking policy update and have an email list of all of those folks that we had recommended to them that they engage in that. So those are not all steps that we expect the planning commission to take at this stage. But were ones that we recommended to the council ordinance committee that they do before they send this to council for a vote. If that helps. So I think maybe, Michael, to answer your question from the perspective of the role of the planning commission at this stage, we can definitely put out a note that, you'll be talking about this at your next meeting, for example, if that is your interest and intent. We can post something on Front Porch Forum that you're talking about it and try to solicit some comment for you in your meetings specifically. But we would continue to make those recommendations to the council as they continue their work on it.
Any other questions? Okay, so I think the plan for tonight is first Megan's going to do a more in-depth, I'll call it introduction or explanation of the ordinance. You've prepared your slides and I think I'm understanding this correctly. You'll explain more to us than what we've gotten in the past of just what's all in here. And then following that discussion, based on the commission's discussion at our last meeting, it seemed like I'll call it the more controversial part of this, or the part that's there seemed to be a bigger spread of opinions on, was the TDM, and probably the more challenging piece of this. And I thought, given the limited amount of time that we have, that it would make sense for us to after we hear from Megan, that our focus, at least initially, be on the TDM part of it, because I think that's where there's going to be, again, I think it will be a bigger discussion for us over how that gets handled. And I know Megan has some thoughts on that. I have my own thoughts on it, and others may have some thoughts on it. And then once we get through that, we could go back and look at the parking requirements themselves. But again, at our last meeting and other discussions I've had, the concept of the parking requirements seems like folks are, I don't know about the details of it, but the concept of it, people were more in alignment with. And I think we'll come together easier on that one. I think it was the TDM that seemed, again, like it was the more challenging piece of this. So again, after we hear from Megan, I thought the best place for us to jump into would be the TDM side of it. And with that, Megan.
Okay. So in your agenda packet, I shared the slides from the joint meeting that you had all been invited to with the council ordinance committee. The markups on the ordinance itself, and the markups include both what was originally referred by the council to its ordinance committee, as well as a number of changes that are highlighted in that document based on the conversations that we at a staff level have had so far with the council ordinance committee. And a more legible map of our current zoning districts. I know that there was an image of the map in the slides from before, but it was really hard to make out where the districts were. So there's also a map there for you. So to just start at the highest level again, this proposed amendment eliminates the minimum on-site parking requirements for all parts of the city. Currently, we have eliminated the minimum only in what is called the multimodal mixed use district, which is generally downtown and the corridors of the city, the major corridors, and other mixed use areas of the city. So this expands that elimination of minimum requirements to all properties. It translates the minimum parking requirements instead to a maximum allowable parking on site. And the way that this was structured initially is that it simply took the provisions of the existing ordinance and applied it to the minimum parking table to generate a maximum number. So the original draft of this that we all received actually made no changes to the kind of policy approach towards the number of parking spaces that we would be looking at for certain uses. We have identified some problems in that, which we'll talk about and have proposed some recommendations for. And then the third major thing that it does is creates new tiers to require transportation demand management, which we call TDM, to apply citywide as well. So extends those requirements to the shared use and neighborhood parking districts and establishes some new lower thresholds for that transportation demand management requirement in some of those districts. Otherwise, it maintains all of the requirements of the TDM program that were added to our ordinance when we made the updates back in 2020. So what I had told Andy that I thought might be helpful, and this is for especially for the newer commissioners, this is kind of a model that we would use for bigger ordinance amendments like this, is to walk through the, page by page, what's in the markups and explain kind of how those three concepts get translated into all the detailed language changes that are proposed here. So I can do that if folks think that that would be helpful, just as a way to orient you to what's proposed today. Yeah.
Sound good,
All right.
folks?
And Andy, really quick, I know that Bryn has to leave here in just a minute, so I don't know if Bryn, did you want to say anything before I get started?
Thanks. No, I just wanted to say that it looked like the changes that you guys made helped make this more just and equitable, and I'm really excited to keep working on this. I think it's a really great amendment.
All right, thank you. Okay, so would you like me to share my screen, or would you just like me to tell you what page number I'm on so that you can walk through this on your own?
Do people have the ordinance in front of them or access to it? If everybody does, it's just as easy for you to tell us what page you're on, but if people don't have it, then I think it'd be good to have it shared screened. Anyone need it shared screen? Okay.
No? Okay, great. That'll make this a little bit easier then. Okay. So starting on page 12 of your agenda packet is this is the first page of the proposed ordinance changes. And this is in a slightly different format than what you usually see as a commission because it's in the council's ordinance template. But this starts to outline the sections of the ordinance that are modified as part of this amendment. And actually starts with a section from Article 4, which is one of our, always one of our favorite sections of the ordinance to talk about, which is what we generally term for unrelated. And Scott, you can jump in here at any point to help out with going through these. So the reason that this is here is because in the discussion with the Council Ordinance Committee, staff had raised the concern that when we start changing parking policy, we touch all sorts of other parts of our ordinance. It's not just Article 8 that we impact. And one of the places that could be impacted by eliminating the minimum requirements are the standards that we have for when you can exceed 4 unrelated occupants in residential zoning districts. Those are based on not only the square footage of the dwelling unit itself, but also the ability to provide additional parking spaces on the property. So in talking this through at one of the council ordinance committee meetings, they had provided us direction that said, we essentially want to make sure that the standards that are in place today for how to add additional occupants in those situations remain unchanged. So we are just adding some language here to make it clear that in order to exceed those residential occupancy limits, you would still have to meet the same number of parking spaces as you would today. And this is really necessary because otherwise there would be no minimum parking requirements for those residential units under these changes. So that's the first part you see on page 12 and at the top of page 13. As we move into the next page, the changes are mostly just to make some minor wording changes to the intent of each of the parking districts. They don't change the meaning of any of the districts themselves. As we move on to page 14, we start to get into how parking relates to existing structures and existing parking that has been permitted under prior permits. So the first section that you see here that is highlighted and actually suggested to be moved down lower on the page was something that we inserted in the ordinance when we made our minimum parking changes the last time. In the downtown, in the multimodal mixed use district, we should have chosen a different name for that because that's actually really hard to say. In the MMU district, we have a provision that enables applicants who have previously permitted a project to come in and apply for an administrative permit to release the project from its parking requirements. And this was done intentionally as a way to help promote, especially in places like downtown and other mixed use parts of the city, to help kind of facilitate and promote easier sharing of existing parking resources where they could benefit other nearby uses, as well as to help promote infill development in those areas where they'd otherwise be constrained by their parking requirements. So again, this was one of the issues that we raised with the council ordinance committee and asked how they wanted this standard to apply to other parts of the city. And we were all in agreement that this provision makes sense in the multimodal mixed use district, but that this doesn't make sense for neighborhood and shared parking districts where, especially where things like structured parking is not as easy to come by, and wanted to make sure that, you know, projects in those areas continue to maintain their existing permitting requirements for parking. So under this, we have simply moved that standard into a section of the ordinance that makes more sense and clarifies that it does not apply within neighborhood and shared use districts. And then at the bottom of the page, we've clarified that when a change of use or an expansion of a use occurs, the parking requirements are only applicable to a new use or the expanded use, not to whatever is already existing. This is just a clarification, really, I think, of that section, right, Scott? Yeah. So that's what you see there. And feel free to interject with questions as we go through this if you have them. There are lots of pages of this document, so I don't want to just talk at length. On the next page, there are a number of standards that are in our parking ordinance that are no longer applicable when we eliminate minimum requirements.
Megan, can you call out the page numbers as you're going through them, just so we're sure that we're on the right page?
Yes. So I'm now on page 15, and in the top left corner, you'll see page 4 of the resolution. Page
So 15 of 77?
15 of 77. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
In particular, there are standards here about how parking applied to affordable and historic buildings, affordable housing and historic buildings, as well as non-conforming structures. Neither of these sections are applicable under this proposed change because minimum parking is no longer required. Let's see here. The next section starts to set up for section 8.1.8. Again, add some new introductory language to describe the purpose of why we're switching from minimums to maximums. And again, just reiterates that some language there to ensure that we're not impacting the for unrelated section in any way. The next, let's see, the rest of page 15 and all of the pages until we get to the top of page 22 of 27 are simply striking the minimum parking requirements. When we skip down then to page 22 of 27, 22 of 77, we get to section 8.1.9 and start to look at maximum on-site parking. And what has happened in large part is all of the stuff from the minimum section got moved to this maximum section and kind of reframed as our new standard. So these tables now, as I mentioned before, let's see here, on line 174 here, table 8.1.9-1. These were the standards that used to give us guidance on how we would use our minimum parking requirements to set a maximum number. So what we see in this new table, starting on line 177, is just that that methodology applied to every single use that was in our old minimum parking table. That's how the council came up with the new standards that are in table 8.1.9, with some exceptions. So you can see here in the comment at the top of table 8.1.9 that we talked this through with the council ordinance committee about, that there were a couple of gaps in how that methodology worked before, where the minimum was 0. If you multiply a minimum by 125%, you still have 0. So we talked to them about how to address situations where the maximum allowable parking for a use was 0, and agreed that we would change all of those situations where the maximum was 0 to 1 instead. So for example, if a project would have been limited to 0 spaces per 1,000 square feet, it's now limited to 1 space per 1,000 square feet. So as we go through the table, you'll just see the replacement for each use there. Sharon brought up a couple of questions about certain types of uses and how maximums relate to those maximum parking limits relate to those uses in her comments. Another kind of category of uses that we at a staff level discussed were these various automobile-oriented uses, whether it was auto sales, auto body shops, car lots, salvage yards, even things like public works garages and yards. When we actually kind of look at these numbers translated from minimums to maximums, we had some questions about whether or not as a maximum number, these are actually the appropriate number. And instead of getting kind of into the weeds with you all about what the right kind of maximum number of parking spaces should be for every use, I think we wanted to get your thoughts on how we wanted this policy to treat those types of uses. So for example, there are a couple of comments in the document that you can see, such as on page 23 about auto sales, or auto body shops, and how something like Brian's Auto on North Ave under these maximum limits would be really limited to only 10 parking spaces for their whole property. They have many more parking spaces than that. When these changes go into place, you know, they would be a non-conforming use and be allowed to continue, but they would have significant limits to being able to expand their use. Is that a situation that we want to happen? Or do we want these parking standards to be slightly more permissive for land uses that we know are primarily vehicle oriented in nature? So that is kind of a directional question that we wanted to pose to you all.
While we're here, why don't we address that one?
Yep.
Makes sense.
That would be helpful.
I could give you my initial input on that, and then you're welcome to hear from others. And my input on that is, when you're dealing with like a garage or something like that, it seems like the car is not there for parking. The car is there because it's a product that is being serviced. Not much different than like if you're bringing an appliance to an appliance repair store, that when it's there because it's being the product that's being serviced as opposed to somebody's there parking it. It just seems like that shouldn't even fit into a parking category. There may be people coming and going for reasons, but if you're just leaving your car there to be serviced, that doesn't seem like, to me, it's parking.
I guess
More
that
like
is,
inventory. Michael?
yeah, similarly, I was interested, it looked like the addition of the bays, the auto bays were not something that was part of the old ordinance. Is that true? Was that a red line that was added?
The additional parking for the bays?
Well, is it meant to be?
Right.
I guess maybe you can just clarify for me on auto body shop and automobile repair, the inclusion of the bays and the
Yeah.
the
Happy
gross
to.
area number.
Yep, happy to. So this whole table expresses itself as language that's being added because it's really just being moved from a different section of the ordinance. So yes, in the past, we would have required a minimum number of 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet plus 1 space for every bay. That is the old standard for the neighborhood or for the shared use district, for example. Now we're saying that that's actually the maximum number of spaces that we have. Another example of this that Scott and I talked, or 2 other examples of these kinds of uses that Scott and I talked through, are things like the GMT bus barn and the city's public works garage on Pine Street, where just by their nature, there is a lot of vehicle storage because it's where, you know, buses and trucks and snowplows and employee vehicles and everything are stored when they're not in use. Those are situations where I think we would probably want to make sure that we have a higher maximum for those situations, because we would consider any stored bus to be a parked bus and would count towards the parking maximum in this situation. A third example is, Andy, I appreciate what you were saying about like auto service, as, you know, it's not so much a parked car, it's a service vehicle. But there are situations where you have parked cars that are like a retail sale of a product, like a car dealership, and how you would like to treat those circumstances.
For me, a car dealership, again, it's a product. It's not a vehicle that's being parked. It's the inventory that they have. And, you know, for the customers who are coming and for the employees who are there, who are coming, parking their cars there and looking at the inventory, that all to me would count as parking. But vehicles that are whether they're in the building, whether they're in the, you know, in the lot, that to me is all, it's not vehicles, it's inventory. and those should be treated differently.
Does anybody else have any different perspective on that?
Michael?
I would just reiterate, I think Andy's characterized it perfectly. It's inventory, and it's like storing pieces of metal outside. That may be a use you don't want to have, but it's kind of a different description other than parking in many ways.
I agree with Andy, and just this table shows like how difficult it is to, regulate this kind of thing, this dizzying number of, we got crematories on here. Like, I mean, it's, the intent of this rule is to get rid of parking requirements and maybe also lower the cost of housing, but, like, we have to get into the weeds about bowling alley parking. It seems a little crazy to me.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, Alex. And I think I've said this before, like when you look at uses at this level and try to decide what is the right amount of parking for them, it makes you realize like how hard this all is to get exactly right.
Yeah.
I would say overall, what our policy has tried to do is balance the provision of some on-site parking to meet the need, but help limit excessive parking across the board for all uses. And so I don't know from a staff perspective that we think that many of the uses probably need to be updated significantly at this point, but these auto-related uses stuck out to us because it's fundamentally in conflict with the nature of the use itself.
Yeah. I mean, overall, I think some of the challenges with doing this kind of a table are ones where numbers change or uses change. Like if there's a parking lot associated with a building or with a use that has, some number of parking, and you change the number of employees, because some of these are tied to the number of employees. If for a year during COVID, you have less employees, you have to get rid of some of your parking spaces. If in a year you hire more people, you then build more spaces, but then and on some of these, if you're just you're not the owner of the building, but you're just a tenant in there, does the owner of the building now have to change their parking, get rid of parking because somebody is renting space in their building that is a different use that has less parking maximums? So I think one of the challenges with this is not so much the parking maximums as much as the variation that could happen among changes of use, changes of numbers of employees, and what happens in those situations. How is that accommodated for? This is also, the maximum uses are with all of zoning. I'm going to talk more about this when we get to the other section, but presumably everyone is grandfathered to begin with. And so this is only when there's a change of use or a change of something. And to have, for example, a change of employees impact zoning requirements or grandfathering, I think is just going to be a challenge. Probably the biggest challenge for you, Scott.
Yeah, I don't know, Scott, I see you came off mute. Did you want to?
Yeah, and Andy's making a good point here, and I'm not sure what the answer is offhand, but I think it should be addressed before this gets enacted. What do we do with multi-use properties where we have consistent or semi-consistent changes in uses? Are we going to go out there annually and say, to Steve Conan's soda plant, hey, you're actually over your 125% limit now, take up some asphalt, but then next year it changes it to something else where it's okay, and so he can put it back. I don't think we want to be in that position. I think we want to basically say that what you've got now for these properties is okay. We don't want to see more necessarily, but if the mix of uses lowers the requirement, we need to articulate under what circumstances, if any, would require folks to remove asphalt.
Yeah.
Is it removal of asphalt or is it just removal of parking spaces? Because it's not a issue about like permeability or lot coverage. It's an issue about uses for parking. So I don't necessarily think it means removing asphalt. It could be putting a planter up that blocks that parking space or creating an outdoor seating spot. So I don't know if it's actually that onerous and difficult and expensive to eliminate a parking spot.
Michael?
How other, I guess the residential side of this and even mixed use buildings seems a little more straightforward. How have other communities looked at these kind of, I mean, what my brain wants to do is basically collapse all these different kind of categories into something that's just more usable or that's more facts and circumstance based. Yeah, precisely, Alex. And so I'm just wondering what other, because they were not the first community to try and set maximum parking standards. What have other folks done on the commercial side?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've looked at a couple of examples. There's an organization that's compiled a map of all the communities in the country that have either significantly reduced or eliminated parking requirements from their zoning ordinances. I was actually poking through a couple of them today to look at examples of places that have pivoted to maximums. And I would say that some places continue to have maximums that are driven by these sort of finer grain land uses like ours is. Other places have maximums that are higher, like broader categories, like for residential, for commercial kind of a thing. As far as, you know, what is the calculation that you use to set the maximum number? I can look into some other examples of how they address this issue of what happens when you're changing uses or changing the intensity of a use that would impact what your maximum number would be. And that threshold that Scott was asking about, which is like, when would we ask people to take parking out? We can look at some examples for how they address that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is, but there needs to be a process for what happens when things change, when number of employees change, if parking's tied to number of employees, or when it's tied to a use, if the uses change. Just how does that get accommodated? And also there are places in here like places of worship that are, you know, set the maximum based on every 4 seats. Well, I know some of the places I've gone to, depending on what the event is, the number of seating changes. You know, on high holidays, they fill up the whole place with seats, and on regular days, you know, it's only the, you know, the chapel synagogue part of itself that has the seating. So how are you counting all of this? So I don't know what the answers are, but I think it just needs to be clear on whatever that process is or whatever the answers are.
I'd say that pre-existing nonconformities for something physical is fairly cut and dry. But in this case, we're talking about the physical parking, the physical thing that's driven entirely by the use of the property. So it's unique. It's not like a pre-existing non-conforming house sitting in a setback, right? I mean, the use in the house can change a number of times without affecting that. But for the parking, the extent of parking, if we're talking about a maximum, is driven entirely by the use. You know, we have a few provisions in the CDO that refer to a certain date. So things in existence as of that date can be that way, but can't get bigger or change or whatever the standard is. The point is refer to the date. You know, offhand, maybe that makes sense here.
Michael, did you?
Well, just so if we have the maximum, I guess this is a question for everyone. So just walk me through this. I mean, basically, like if you felt like the metric wasn't appropriate for you, then you'd go through a zoning ordinance exception, same as any other process. Is that right?
Well, there's no, for the exception, you mean through the maximum parking waiver provision?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You'd get a waiver to exceed that.
You could apply for a waiver to exceed some portion of the maximum.
Yeah, I mean, yes is the short answer, but I think that's really tied to you wanting to do something new. I don't know that really, I don't think it would be a good fit, Michael, for something like the soda plant, right? Where it's just multiple small uses changing around over time.
No, I agree. I don't think you want to be in that situation, but I feel like that's the situation you might find yourself in.
Yeah.
And so it sort of begs a solution that's can consider the facts and circumstances at any particular moment in time. And that's why I was kind of wondering about analogs elsewhere. It almost seems like you need some humans to make a decision about what that particular use is and what's required, rather than having to be a static number.
Sounds like you're suggesting a discretionary review process.
That's not what you want, but it's like,
No.
it's a tricky thing.
No, this is a great question, Andy, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I especially hear the point about when the metric is tied to people rather than the physical thing. The size of the building, which is more, as Scott pointed out, is more static than the number of people who might be working in it. So we'll take another look at that question as well, and see if we can bring you guys some thoughts. I think, on a more global level, some of you will remember that we've brought this up in the context of just how fine-grained some of our land uses are in general within the CDO. We have several different types of retail, for example, that are called out as being different from one another. And some of them may be permitted in some places and not in others, or may have different parking requirements depending on where they are. One of the things that I know Scott and I share in common is that, we really strive to try to reduce, potential for either redundancy or conflict within the ordinance. And we've been trying to streamline land uses when questions come in front of you. Like, we had a food and beverage processing amendment a few years ago, and we condensed a number of very similar, alcoholic beverage production uses into one definition and treat them all the same now. As we're talking about parking requirements, it sort of begs that similar approach, but I think for the purposes of this policy that we have in front of us, we're trying to start from keeping largely what's intact already and making some tweaks around the edges, just because we don't have the capacity to sort of comprehensively overhaul this parking table today. But I think that these questions that you all have asked about the maximum, and particularly ones that are driven off of uses that are prone to changing frequently, we can come up with some solutions for you on.
Megan, with what you were just saying, just made me think about form-based code. I'm not sure what the trigger was, but
I'm not sure either.
This seems to be the exact opposite of what we were trying to accomplish with form-based code. With form-based code, the whole goal was to say, put up a structure, here's your general structure, and we're not going to look at the uses. Like in the downtown form-based code, if I recall correctly, I think we got rid of all the conditional uses, or just about all the conditional uses. We either said you're allowed to do it or you're not allowed to do it. There may be a couple still that are conditional. We just said, if you fit within this building and you meet the standards, then do whatever you want in there. If you want to put a auto dealership inside, fine. If you want to put whatever you want to put in, fine. And this seems like it's an end run around that, which is do whatever you want in the building, but we're going to take a really hard look at what your parking is for every particular kind of use that you're trying to do. And I wonder if there's a way to model this somewhat after, and I don't know what the answer is. I can't figure that out just sitting here right now, but if there's a way to model these maximums somewhat like we did the form-based code, which is rather than get into the nitty-gritty detail of all of this, something more global, which I think somebody mentioned before as well. Just seems like, especially in the downtown district that we've created the form-based code for, this is almost undoing that by now saying, do whatever you want in there, but we're going to take a really hard look at whatever you're going to do in there because it now has to be reflected in the parking.
So,
Form-based parking.
Sorry, Alex, what'd you say?
Form-based parking is what Andy said.
Form-based
Yeah.
parking.
So I don't know what the answer is on this, but it just seems like the way this is structured for the downtown is the opposite of what form-based code is. It's making it more complicated than easier.
So I would say that in general, I agree with what you're saying about kind of what our goal was with form-based code, was just to simplify things and focus more on the physical manifestation of buildings rather than the uses within them. As far as how this proposal changes how we treat parking in those areas, it actually doesn't have much of an impact on how parking is already regulated. So we're just making it more explicit through this table. We already require 0 minimums for all uses within the area of the city where the form-based code applies. We had maximums before. They were a little bit harder to see and understand the way that the ordinance was written. So this is just a much more clear and explicit kind of list of the way that the maximums apply to uses within that same area. So it's not actually changing the policy for how we treat maximums in the form-based code area from today.
Well, maybe then by being clearer, and I'm seeing that now, it's making less sense.
Got it.
And it seems to me that if we're doing this process of trying to, limit parking, and I think the maximums are fine. I'm not arguing against that at all. I think it's the approach that we're taking, especially in the form-based code areas, that it would be great if we could figure out a way to really simplify it and not have to. We're already saying we're not going to dig into the uses so much that's going on inside. So it doesn't make sense that we're digging into the uses, the impact the uses are having on parking. If we could just really figure out a way to make the parking as simple as we've tried to make the what's going on inside the building, I think that would be more consistent. And you might be right about this is the way it was before, but if it was, I think we should have done a better job before on it.
I would pipe in and say, I think it makes sense to recommend that this doesn't apply in the form code, because you can't have a surface parking lot. You can only have surface parking in the 3rd lot layer, right? It's heavily limited as to its form in terms of surface parking and even in terms of structured parking. I know the form code doesn't line up perfectly with a multimodal district, but I think it makes sense to say, look, this doesn't apply in the form code, because parking, the extent and layout and form of parking in the form code it's heavily prescriptive now. And I think applying this standard to the form code is a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think Scott's right. I also think if there's an opportunity to share parking within the form-based districts, and what I mean by that is you still have a parking demand. And it'd be nice to be able to build it and use it and walk to your neighbor rather than have your neighbor build redundant parking.
Yeah, so we can get to shared parking here in just a minute. But yeah, we can take a look at whether even having maximums for the MMU district makes sense, I think is what I'm kind of hearing Scott suggest, if others agree.
Will there'll still be maximum parking just by what they're allowed to build in the first place under form-based code. Isn't that right? So it's not like you could go wild building parking. There's still maximums. It just comes in a different way, if I'm understanding it right.
Correct.
Through form standards rather than numerical standards. The only challenge with that, and we can take a look at this and think about how something like that could apply. The multimodal mixed use district applies to more than just the form code area of the city. So it's all of our neighborhood activity centers, the neighborhood mixed use center districts, and along all of our major thoroughfares. where we don't have similar quorum standards in place. So we can take a look at this idea and see about bringing a recommendation back to you for that. Okay. Unless there's anything else specific in this table 8.1.9 that continues all the way through page 28, we can move on. All right, so then when we get on to page 29 of 77, this is where the section that Michael was asking about, the parking waivers, are located. We've retained the section that talks about waivers from the maximums, but we've eliminated the section that talks about waivers from the minimums because it doesn't apply. The bottom of page 29 is where this issue of shared parking comes from. There are a number of standards here that span page 29 and 30 related to shared parking, essentially all of which become irrelevant if we have no minimum on-site parking requirements. So the proposal here is to strike all of the section related to shared parking, except for retaining a section that says that, you know, you can share parking with off-site users, and limiting that to ensure that we don't have situations where parking is the primary use on a property, except for where that is otherwise allowed in our zoning ordinance. So that's what you see on page 29 and the top of page 30. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to jump in before you got too far down the line. I think just the maximum, the nature of the maximum here just brings heightened scrutiny to some of these other sections. So sorry for leading us astray, but I was just reading through this waiver of the parking, the maximum parking limitations. And so the, you know, A1 or AI, you know, is that I think you're going to see the most requests for waivers on one-off uses, and it's requiring, you know, study of peak demand for similar uses in the area. I think the whole, I would guess the problem is going to be uses that don't have precedent in the area. So I just think that the nature of the maximum just brings, again, I don't think it's kind of consistent with what we were saying before. If there's a way to more generalize and perhaps change the definition to be a little less prescriptive, you have less chance of having to rely on this. But in the nature of it being so prescriptive, I think in a maximum amount that, you know, is more threatening. It introduces scarcity, so I think it's prone to have a different reaction. You're going to see this more, and I think you're going to see it more for one-off uses that don't exist in that district. So like the one that comes to mind for me, that like a recreational facility, say a climbing gym, for example, that doesn't have waiting, you know, that doesn't necessarily meet the same standards as like a regular, like a Y or something like that. So I think that's where we're going to run into trouble. And so I highlight that because I think the problem was going to be when you don't have similar uses, and that'll be a difficult thing to figure out.
Yeah, I hear your point. I think I think that there will probably always be circumstances like that. And, you know, in the example of a climbing gym, we might be able to look to something else that maybe isn't recreation based, but, you know, we might be able to find some similar examples. I mean, we could maybe include something in here about like actual user patterns or something to help us be able to evaluate the demand. But I also want to be careful about making the kind of standards for these waivers overly accommodating, because our goal is to still kind of keep a limit on the amount of parking, right? That we're talking about exceeding a maximum amount. So, Scott, do you have any thoughts on that?
Overly accommodating. I've never heard that in zoning in the same context.
Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, your point is valid, right? I mean, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to limit parking proliferation. We don't want these handed out left and right.
But I do hear your point, Michael, just about the one-off uses can always be kind of challenging. So yeah, I mean, Scott and I can talk about this a little bit more too, and see if there's anything else that we should do here. So Scott, will you pick up where I left off at the bottom of page 30 for just a second? Because my computer's about to die and I need to plug it in.
Okay. Bottom of page 30. So much of what happens on page 30, all right, good, I'm unmuted, is just striking things that pertain to parking minimums. So without parking minimums, those sections become moot. As Megan pointed out, section 8115 is all about minimum parking waivers. Parking minimums go out the door, so 8115 is a big old section that gets zapped. So that brings us down to page 32 and the TDMs. So the first section of TDM on page 32 for the MMU district is unchanged from what we have now in Article 8. The proposed changes come into play for the shared use parking district, so sort of our smaller neighborhood mixed use districts, neighborhood activity centers, and then finally within the neighborhood district. So you'll see that the thresholds between the MMU district, the shared use district, and finally residential get lower. And Megan, you're back. Megan laptop, I just noticed that. So we as staff have concerns about the low threshold being proposed, especially with the 5 dwelling units, and in particular in the neighborhood districts, and the ongoing 10-year obligations for TDM implementation and reporting requirements. And I will let Megan speak more eloquently to that now that she's back.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So we've shared this concern with you all before, and talked about it a little bit in the joint committee meeting with some of you as well. Just about some of the concerns around why we think that this may warrant more study before implementing TDM standards at this scale and in these locations within the city. Some of which just have to do with the kind of physical environment and the ability to implement certain TDM measures within residential neighborhoods, for example. The availability of shared parking, for example, the ability to dedicate a car share space on site, for example, and just kind of the scale and appropriateness of these thresholds. So, you know, similar to some of the other parking questions, we've been trying to look to some other examples of communities that have created TDM programs, especially ones that live in their zoning ordinance. And we've seen some references to these kinds of concerns in other TDM studies as well. 2 examples that we were looking at specifically today were from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and from San Francisco, actually. They were 2 TDM studies that David had done some research on back when we were doing our work before. And both of them make reference to really the importance of doing a more comprehensive study to set the goals for a TDM program and then figure out the right tools and to carefully evaluate what all those right tools are to help you implement those TDM goals. And then the resulting TDM policies for both of those communities actually recognize the difficulty of implementing TDM programs for projects of very small scales. And they each define what a small scale might be. A number of the TDM programs that I looked into today set their minimum threshold at about 10 dwelling units as the low end for implementing TDM. And in San Francisco's case, they specifically spoke to, just the concern that you may have different TDM goals for really small projects and for certain geographic areas of your community than in more dense mixed use areas. That you may have trouble physically achieving some of your TDM goals in a residential area or for very small projects, and the sort of outsized burden of monitoring and compliance for very small projects relative to what TDM benefit they bring to the community in the sort of model that we've been looking at. So I think it kind of helped Scott and I wrap our heads a little bit more around some of the concerns that we had about just simply kind of taking the TDM standards that we created a couple of years ago that we've really only been implementing for a year so far and expanding them to developments across the city, and particularly developments that are smaller in size on the residential side of things. And as Andy said, I know that this was a section that he in particular wanted to spend some time getting your thoughts on.
Alex, and then Emily.
Megan, was that threshold previously set at 10 units and then it was changed recently to 5? And
which one? In our ordinance?
Yeah.
Yes, so our current threshold is 10 units for the multimodal mixed use district. And the changes that are proposed on page 33 would extend the TDM requirements to the shared use and neighborhood districts and would set the threshold at 5 dwelling units.
Yeah, I mean, 5 does seem awfully small. And then we're talking creation, like I could think of a half dozen of new construction of residential buildings over the last 10 years, but I don't know how many of them were 5 units. And I mean, just how often is 5 going to come along?
5 to 10 units. I don't know, Scott, do you want to speak to that from the permitting side?
I don't know. It just seems like 5 is better than 10. I mean, 10 is better than 5.
We don't see a whole lot better in the 5 unit range. I couldn't give you a firm number offhand. I mean, it's a few here and there. Most of the projects are well above 10 for new multi-unit housing.
I will say this, what Moreau is talking about in his 10-point action plan talks about the missing middle. That is the missing middle. And I'll tell you, there are other impediments besides parking that speak to that. And we'll probably, when Megan presents this to us later, I can tell you my perspective on where those are. But I think there's a reason you're not getting the 5s, and it's historic and a number of other things too. But so I think you could get them, and I think we're trying to create a range of options for people to develop housing without the parking. So even though you're not getting them now, I think there's a way to unlock it.
Emily?
I wondered if we could go over what the TDM requirements are. I'm understanding it to be like a free GMT pass, car share membership, but limited for a certain number of years, reporting, unbundling the cost, car share spot, annual meeting. What other are, like, am I missing anything about what the requirements are for the TDM?
So those are the transportation centric ones. There's also requirements about education and outreach. And then there's also parking utilization studies and ongoing reporting on that.
So I guess my feeling about this is that what we're asking for is for projects to create like a transportation system. And what we need is a citywide transportation system. And asking little projects to create their own mini transportation system is just incredibly inefficient. And it only benefits the projects that are coming online. And it adds cost to these projects, as you know, Bruce is bringing up. This is like the missing middle, and hiring somebody to manage a transportation system if you have a 5-unit building is kind of absurd. And then just the compliance, and how is the city going to follow up on this and make sure that's actually happening when all we hear, we're hearing about how short-staffed everybody in the city is, and like, who's going to do that, right? I mean, are you going to do that, Megan? Are you going to be in charge of following up on every 5-unit building that's going up in the city to make sure that they're holding their annual meeting? So, I mean, if there's no accountability for the things that we're asking people to do, then it's just stupid to ask them to do it. I would say that, asking for a free bus pass and a free car share membership, we should be giving out free bus passes and free car share memberships to everybody in the city. And we should be paying for it by charging for parking. We give away free parking in the city, and it has a huge value. And we subsidize parking. We subsidize people using cars. So we need a transportation system. It has to be paid for somehow. I don't think it should be paid for by new 5-unit projects, because I don't think it's going to have the intended outcome.
Are you done, Emily?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to strongly echo what Emily was just saying and build off of that a little bit. I think you're hitting it exactly right on this one. I look at the TDM, and I look at this whole package and TDM as a way to change the way that we do things in Burlington, and recognizing a major need to change things. And when I see this TDM the way it's written here, is number one, it's going to put a huge burden on those that are trying to build new housing and new development that we desperately want in Burlington. And it's barely going to address the problem because it's limited only to those new developments, to those major changes of what's happening. I think if we really want to accomplish this, zoning is the absolute wrong place to put this type of provision. It belongs, it should be a general citywide ordinance that applies across the board. And trying to expect, as Emily was just saying, especially small users, I'll call it, to implement this, for us. I think, again, that's the wrong approach. I think it should be something that could be done, could be done citywide, and it should be done in a more comprehensive way that's not expecting lots and lots and lots of different small entities and individuals to try to put together these disjointed programs all over the place. I think, if we're really serious about this as a city, we ought to do a comprehensive plan to put this together, not through zoning, not something that's grandfathered, not something that, you get a zoning violation for if you don't do it quite right. That Scott and the people in your office have to now try and figure out how you're going to do this through zoning, which just, I think, we started it off that way because that was the, a place that could be housed, but as we try to expand it this way, I just don't see it being a practical way to accomplish any of this. And the reality is it's going to take years and years and years and years for this to have any impact because of the slow pace of development that we're doing in the city. Even if we bump it up by a lot, a lot's not a lot in Burlington because we're so fully developed already. So if we want to accomplish this, it should be I think it should be a comprehensive program done through ordinance or something else, but not through zoning, because zoning, I think, is absolutely the wrong vehicle to do this through.
Yeah.
Basically all the reasons that Emily just said.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I don't want to underscore, I don't want to underestimate the staff time of at any part of the city to monitor this. Scott and I had, in one property I owned, every 2 years I had this requirement, and he'd have to write me 5 emails because I would forget. And I had to survey all my tenants. It probably took like 10 hours for a 10-unit building every other year. It was a cost. And I think where that really hits hardest, one of the unseen things in housing is that we need more producers of housing, more people to step in and take a risk and say, I'll build a 5-plex. And the more complex you make it, the regulations, the more it makes it such that only the bigger developers, the bigger property owners, they create a system and they can apply it across the board. They have economies of scale and it works for them. But many other folks wouldn't be able to get their arms around it and get a system, and it wouldn't make sense. So they wouldn't do it. They build 4 units if the threshold is 5, which is exactly what we don't want to do.
Anyone? Michael?
Yeah, the only thing I completely agree with this. It's what I've been advocating for since the beginning. I think the only thing I'd want everybody to be aware of is that this is kind of our leverage with the smaller projects to get them to participate in a TDM paradigm, unless by some larger citywide ordinance. But so I don't exactly have a solution on that, other than to just say if you just completely eliminate it, then you lose the ability to lever them into participating. So, but I don't think it makes any sense. But part of me just wants to see what the study comes up with for, in particular, the neighborhood areas, and then modify the zoning accordingly. But we're in a place where we can't necessarily do that. So that's kind of, I think, part of the challenge here. But I would just say the zoning is a way to get to sort of force people to participate.
I don't disagree that we want people to participate and want to set up a program that would require people to. I just don't think zoning is the one that's really going to it will get a very, very small number of people to participate. Only those that are actually doing, a development that fits within this. If we do by ordinance, the city can still require people to participate. It's just, you could then require more people to participate. And then if the city actually takes on the program itself or creates, facilitates the creation of a broader TDM program, then not only can people be required to, but it will be easier to participate in it. So I
Yeah,
think this, we may not have the leverage as a planning commission because zoning is really our main tool, but the city would have even more leverage doing it, I think, in a more comprehensive way.
right. And I think that was actually, that point was one of the ones that we made. And I mean, I've mentioned it in the context of these amendments that we're talking about now, but I know that we also talked about this when we were doing our amendment that introduced the TDM standard in the zoning ordinance before, is that this is not the most fair way to implement TDM measures either, because it overlooks existing development and focuses only on new developments contributions to TDM. And so, I think that concern remains. I know there are examples of communities that have taken approaches, citywide approaches, like Cambridge is one of them. It doesn't live in their zoning ordinance. It lives in a part of their code of ordinances as a community. And it's not based on new development. It's just based on having parking. And so the kind of measures that you are required to implement, or the ways that you're trying to mitigate your transportation demand, is based on the amount of parking you're actually providing. I'm helping to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. So there are different models out there that I think that our study can help inform us on, both in terms of, what is the right approach. I mean, plenty of communities do this through zoning. So it's not to say that at the end of that, we won't still be doing something through zoning. I know some communities do drive TDM through their zoning, but recognize certain types of projects that are exempt from TDM. They might say, like, small developments only have to achieve X number of points in the TDM plan, where larger developments have to achieve 10 times more points in their TDM plan. They might have reporting requirements for larger projects, not ongoing annual reporting projects for requirements for smaller projects. And so I think that our study will help us to kind of suss out what makes sense in terms of all of these different aspects of a TDM program for the different parts of the city and the different regulatory places that it could be housed. And I think
Megan?
Andy.
Oops, sorry to interrupt, but when you look at what's going on in other zoning and other communities, we have, I mean, I know in Vermont and in Burlington in particular, we have the grandfathering issue. And I know from research I've done that in other states, a lot of other states do it differently. They allow there to be like, the economic timeline that grandfathering doesn't last forever like we do here. And one of the disadvantages of using zoning is grandfathering. It's again, it's development specific. And once you've done it, the city loses its flexibility really to change the way it wants to do. We talked a lot about this with the Scott, I think this is where you came up with in the short-term rentals, which was, we realized as we were going through that whole discussion that zoning was appropriate to establish the idea of the short-term rentals, however that might be. But it was through the other codes, the ordinances, that said, here's how we're going to actually regulate them. Yes, you could have it, but here's how we're going to regulate it, because our big fear on the short-term rentals was things change. And with zoning, you can't really change. It's not going backwards. You can't change things the way they are. You can only go forwards and say, if you do this again, it has to change. And I think the TDM is likely to be somewhat the same, that as time goes on, there's going to be a lot of other tools that we could add into this. A lot, we have our list of here's the 5 things you need to do for TDM. And so if you get your permit through zoning, well, those are the 5 things you're required to do. But if we come up with another 5 things that could really help with it, your grandfathered, you don't have to do that. Whereas if it's in the code, like what we did with the short-term rentals, you have lots of flexibility to change things around and keep it modern, keep it updated. And again, make sure it applies across the board and not just to those individuals or those entities that decide they want to try doing development in the city. And when they do that, development impacts everybody. They may be the ones who have to deal with the TDM, but it really impacts everybody. So I really think it's important to have this across the board as much as possible. Otherwise, the goals won't be realized of what we're trying to accomplish with it. But I guess where I started, Megan, was when you're looking to see what other communities do that have it in zoning, just to see whether the implementation of their zoning is the same as what we do here, because that would make a big difference if it's not.
No, that's a great point. And not everybody has the same sort of statutory limitations on pre-existing nonconformities the way that we do.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just one thing. I do think it's important that we convey that there's an administrative burden that needs to be accounted for, because someone needs to be tasked to do this, to learn about it, to educate people on it so it gets better over time, especially if it's evolving. And we tend to put more requirements on permitting inspections, and that job gets more stressful over and over again. I think we just need to be really conscious of that and fund it. Recognize the cost up front and fund part of a position to run it if we're going to run something like this. Particularly if it's like Andy describes and it's collaborative, I think you're going to see a parking management plan that comes up, someone comes up with something that's innovative, that person tasked with it at the city would seek to recommend that to others because they would see it. But I think you have to have someone capable and tasked and with time paid for to do that.
Good. Emily.
Are we all on the same page about and not wanting to have a TDM requirement? I think that the only things I see in the TDM that I think I'd want to have as a requirement are unbundling the costs of parking. And I think that should be a requirement for everyone. not just for new projects. I don't see why that's limited to new projects. And I mean, maybe it's the, reporting that we want to ask projects to give us data that we can track. Otherwise, I think everything else is actually just trying to take what we need from a citywide transportation system and have little micro transportation systems. So I would maybe make a motion that we move this forward, to the city council with a memo that says we don't think there should be a TDM requirement except for those items, and that we should eliminate the parking requirement. I think seems like everybody agrees about that.
Yeah, Emily, I will say I'm totally in agreement with what you're suggesting, but just the timing, I think what we should do is ask Megan and or Scott to pull something together for us to look at our next meeting that's along the lines of what we discussed. And
Right.
I would like to hear from folks to see, Emily's thoughts that her sense is that we're fairly in alignment on this, and that's my sense too, but I just want to check and see if that's accurate. Michael?
So the meeting minutes show that I'm in agreement from the last meeting, but I can't help but play devil's advocate. So I think my only concern about this is that, yes, the zoning ordinance is a clunky place for it, but oftentimes these TDM solutions manifest themselves in the built environment, which is the reason they end up in the ordinance in the first place. So I guess I would like to see the comps and think through those a little bit, because I just think of if you have to, what we're creating is parking scarcity, and so that can create some potentially create some creativity, particularly if you have a property owner that's got, say, 3 or 4 properties within a quarter-mile walking distance of each other. And so the TDM sort of forces that relationship in a way that it may not if we take it out of the ordinance. But I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that that's of a consideration. So it'd be nice to see the work that Megan's done.
Yeah, I'm happy to share the examples that David had done some research on for our last parking discussion. I need to be transparent that we're not in a place where we can do this comprehensive study of all the TDM programs right now, because that's actually, we have money in our budget to do this work. And so what I've been trying to say to the council ordinance committee is that they added money into our budget for this fiscal year. We need to focus our capacity on doing that study to help inform us, and that we should do that work first. We're not saying that we should absolutely close the door on ever having TDM strategies in zoning, but that we should just be thoughtful and informed about doing them before we expand, the current standards to other parts and scales, if that makes sense. But I'm happy to pass along some of the examples that we had already looked at before to share with you, both the methodologies for how they established their plans as well as what their standards are.
So just very quickly, in terms of sorry, Andy, I just wanted to pipe in quickly that in terms of a place for this to live, and I understand a citywide TDM is a big lift, the city actually has a parking ordinance. I think it's chapter 22. So it could live there when and if we get to a citywide TDM.
So perhaps an approach to take on the first half of the code of the ordinance that we've been looking at, the maximums, we talked about some different ways to look at it, but fairly consistent with keeping it within the zoning. That I think you Megan and Scott, you were going to go back and take a look and see what changes you might suggest for the discussion based on the discussion we had. On the TDM, we're actually, I think, pretty much in alignment with what you're saying with where you started, Megan, which is before we do anything in the zoning or anywhere, we really need to take a bigger look at this.
Mhm.
And I think what we've come up with in our discussion tonight was really more support for what you're asking to do, and reasons that it may not work so easily in the zoning that's here. So it may be that on that piece of it, rather than making any changes within the ordinance that we have in front of us now, the proposed ordinance, that on that side of it, if you could prepare a memo or something that might be a communication from us to the city council that, it summarizes this larger, concept that we're talking about, that doesn't necessarily, make any concrete saying it has to be done this way or it has to be done that way, but the challenges that we've identified with the way it's being approached and the suggestions of the of potentially better ways to do it, that should all be investigated or looked at through the deeper study that you'd like to do. I mean, I think all of this just really calls out that that's something that's critically important to do before moving forward, because we're kind of working in the blind here without that. And that would be something that the commission could look at our next, presumably our next meeting, which I don't know if you'd have time to get it all done in 2 weeks, but it's that kind of a thing that lets us deal with the the maximum parking side of it one way and deal with the TDM a different way. And then we could communicate all that back to the council.
Yeah, I think if the rest of the commissioners are open to that suggestion, Andy, for how we would treat these two different pieces, I think that seems reasonable from my perspective.
Where does that make sense to other people? We're not necessarily taking a vote tonight, because we would ask staff to put this together and then do our vote at the next meeting if we're in agreement on it. But does that make sense to folks the way I just laid it out?
Sure.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Good.
All right. And we'll find some balance there and kind of saying, Michael, I'm hearing your point about not necessarily saying that the door is definitely closed on zoning, but we have concerns that should be studied. So we'll work on that.
To a certain point, it may be that the short-term rentals might be, somewhat of a model of how we approached it. There was hybrid. Some of it was in zoning to establish it in the first place, and the details that we know probably would change over time ended up in the code. So, there may be a place for both of them.
Yep. Okay.
But that's something to be looked at. Anything else on this item?
So there's one final section that we'll just speak to briefly, and then we can come back to it. So it gets back into kind of like the parking standards and more away from the TDM requirements. Well, I guess it's actually kind of hybrid. So, and it speaks to Sharon's question about how institutional parking management plans work. So on page 35 of the proposed ordinance, you can see some suggested changes that staff introduced to ensure that there's kind of continuity in how this section reads and how it would be applied. So for Michael, I think maybe you are the only one that hasn't been here since we've gone through this process, but as Sandy Tebow spoke to earlier, CATMA helps the 3 institutions, UVM Medical, UVM, and Champlain College, to prepare a joint institutional parking management plan, usually every 5 years, with annual reporting. And what that essentially does is enables the institutions to evaluate their demand and strategies that they are using to either meet or reduce that demand, and submit a plan to the Development Review Board with the Planning Commission's review that essentially provides them with a parking waiver from the minimum requirements that they would have otherwise been required to meet. Without minimum requirements, there is not a kind of a waiver process that joint institutional parking management is fulfilling anymore. However, in reviewing this, Scott and I feel that most of this is still applicable, in that instead of having the institutions prepare this joint management plan to say, hey, look, we can reduce our minimum requirement by X number of spaces, that they're actually just preparing a plan that helps us to evaluate what is the actual demand, how are they meeting that demand, and what are they doing to help reduce that demand, and still bringing it through the process of having the Planning Commission review it and the DRB approve it to use in their development projects to come forward in the future. So Most of the changes that are in here are just to specify that it's not kind of based on the idea of a minimum number that they're seeking to reduce. We've also tried to strengthen some of the specifics around what goes into their parking management plan with regard to the TDM strategies. So before, this ordinance referred to a section about parking management plans that is proposed to be removed in this draft. So we just brought back a couple of specific strategies that they need to consider and made it clear in this section that they need to consider those. And then also speaks to kind of what to do in situations where a development project might come to the DRB that wasn't already planned for in their joint institutional plan. And essentially asks them to kind of look at how the development would otherwise impact the supply and demand calculations that are part of their plan and address, you know, any impact that it might have. So those are the changes that are in that last section there for joint institutional parking management plans.
Michael?
Yes, if they aren't getting a waiver from the minimum requirement, why do they have to do this? Not that they wouldn't necessarily for community relations purposes, but why do they need to do, what's the hook?
That's a great question. Do you want to talk to this, Scott?
I think a primary driver here is for them to demonstrate, the institutions demonstrate how they can manage their parking resources and demands within their boundaries rather than spilling over into adjacent city neighborhoods.
And the other thing that I'll just say is, maybe to put it a little more bluntly, is that the ordinance says that it's required.
Because they have to.
Yeah.
Michael, I highly recommend the JIPMP. It's highly detailed, very interesting plan. Triennial event.
So it's tied to that zoning district, I guess, then? Okay.
Yeah, it's tied to it's basically tied to the district.
So if they want to do any development within, you know, their campus or the district, they have to do this. Whether that's enough of a hook, I don't know, but that's the goal, it seems like.
Well, they also do, I mean, they also don't pay property taxes. And so like if we're looking at a transportation system and supplying transportation system, and we have a huge impact on the city as far as transportation, and they don't pay, you know, they don't pay in as much as everybody else, I think it's reasonable to ask them to manage their own transportation.
And the fact is that if you look by a square foot basis, the two biggest developers in the city are UVM and Champlain College. Like they've done a lot in the last 10 years.
Sorry about that. The building security is leaving, and so I missed the beginning of that conversation after I said it's required, and then I didn't hear much after that. I can listen to the record. I can listen to the recording and catch up.
It wasn't really worth repeating.
All pretty supportive. Michael?
Sorry, I don't know if are we finished with this topic? I did have we went over one thing. I did want to ask a question about on the ADA parking.
Hold on one sec. Anyone else with anything on the institutional plan? Okay, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just hoping you could clarify the note on the ADA parking and what that DOJ requirement is.
Yeah, so this is a question that's come up in a couple of our previous meetings. It's not specific to the TDM requirements, but we are proposing to just change the term that's in the TDM requirements to ADA accessible. So we've looked into this more since your last meeting because it's come up a number of times. The Department of Justice is the one that maintains the standards for ADA accessible parking spaces. And I think probably the simplest way to explain it is that the number of ADA accessible spaces is driven off of how many parking spaces you're providing. So it's a fraction of the number of parking that's being provided. There are also some standards for, if you require a certain number of parking spaces for residential units, you have to require the same number of parking spaces for accessible units, that kind of thing. Our building code includes some standards for when you have to provide accessible housing units, and so therefore would kind of by extension include some of the, at least the residential ADA requirements for parking. But overall, anytime somebody's providing parking in the city, the standards for ADA accessible ratios would be applicable.
I guess,
Yes.
do we think, just to kind of close the loop here, with the maximums, do we think that does that produce enough based on your analysis? Have we had issues with that in the past? Are there enough spaces?
Scott, are you aware of situations where we've had conflicts with providing ADA spaces?
Not aware of any such situations. When Megan talked to me about this earlier, and the CDO refers to ADA standards, but in practice, that's something we rely on the building inspectors for as they administer all things ADA.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've had maximum parking limits in some form for a while in the city now, and I'm not aware of circumstances where those maximums have precluded the provision of ADA parking, mostly because it's federal law, and if people would otherwise be required to do it, they would have to find a way to accommodate it within the spaces they're providing on site. And maybe you would see somebody ask for a parking waiver for a space or two so that they could accommodate it, but I don't have a concern that the maximum limits would significantly impede the ability to comply with that law.
Anything else? Anything else on this, on the minimum parking TDM requirements ordinance?
One other question for
Michael?
Scott, sorry. In the deck here, we have a slide that describes, the kind of what would have been required versus what actually occurred. And I've just been, as we've had this discussion, kind of been curious, understanding that I'm supportive of this ordinance generally and think it will be helpful in promoting some additional housing creation primarily. There are some climate implications, I guess, as well. But with the minimum requirement, do most developments, what is the track record in terms of, because there's a supply and demand issue here, and I don't think we can get away from the fact that there's potential externality, particularly in a residential setting with not enough spaces, if there is a maximum, just because it's hard to anticipate all 20 of those uses that are on that commercial sheet, right? And so I'm just wondering a little bit the inverse of that chart that was provided in this, in terms of, do people often, how much in excess of the minimum do people often build, or do they just typically stick to the minimum? And I'm not saying that's a right number. I'm just kind of curious generally.
That's a good question.
I can say that we've granted exactly one maximum parking waiver ever since the CDO was adopted in 2008. So going way above the minimums is exceedingly rare. Between the minimum and that, I'd say most. I mean, how many parking waivers do we have? I could get that number. I don't have it.
Well, I'm not looking for the waivers necessarily, right? Because it's a minimum. So do most folks just build the minimum, or do they build in excess of the minimum?
I would say my unresearched answer is that most of the time folks build a little bit more than the bare minimum.
And I'm just wondering if there's anything we can learn from that. Again, I'm not trying to enable more parking necessarily, but on some of these one-off commercial uses, I think it might be kind of a helpful number.
So we're going to be bringing this item back at our next meeting, we'll have the changes that we've talked about in the memo that we talked about, and all of these questions and probably more will be good ones for then. I'm just mindful of the time. And it might give Scott more time to think about what you're asking, Michael. So if it's okay, I'd like to move on for tonight and then come back to this at our next meeting. And again, I'm sure there'll be plenty more questions as well.
I
Emily?
actually have to leave. I have a West Coast time meeting I have to be on, so I don't think there's any other action items.
No, just the minutes and communications, but
We have
that's fine.
quorum.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I apologize, but
No problem.
see you next time.
Bye,
Take care.
Emily.
Bye-bye.
So we're going to close out item 4, move on to close out item 5, move on to item 6, which is commissioner items, which is start with upcoming meetings. We have it on January 25th and February 8th, and the executive committee will be meeting on January 25th, right before our regular commission meeting.
At 5:30.
Any other commissioner items or updates?
There was an ordinance committee meeting last week. Alex, are you still the chair?
I have not been on that committee for
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
that-
I'm
then-
sorry.
then-
before
Alex-
pandemic, the before
then-
times.
Then Alex,
Emily
can
is
you
on
give
it.
us an update?
Bruce.
Wow, that clearly shows, like, I'm still in pre-pandemic brain when it comes to the ordinance committee.
Awesome.
We actually did something. Scott brought us a steep slopes amendment that attempts to try to create an overlay and a way of dealing with steep slopes so the city is protected and folks don't get in trouble with buildings sliding down hills. So Scott's preparing something and you'll see it.
It's in your inbox, Megan.
Great.
Good. Thank you. Any other commissioner updates? We'll close out that item, and item 7 is minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications? Motion by Alex, even though you're on mute. I could still see your lips moving. Is there a second? Seconded by Michael. Any discussion?
I have, if I can interject, I will offer that it's a small correction that I picked up. The date for the next commission meeting is wrong in those minutes, so I'll just correct that. It should say the 25th, not the 26th.
Good. Thanks for picking that up. All right.
'Cause
with
I know
that
you all are
change-
driving your schedule off of last meeting's minutes, right?
Exactly. So with that correction, all those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? We have our minutes of communications. On to item 8, which is adjournment. Motion to adjourn by
I move.
Alex, seconded by Michael. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you,
And
Andy.
see you at the
you.
next meeting. Take care.
Kim.
Bye now.